Let's do the Forgotten Realms book tag. This is a book tag my friend Liam made up. I will link his original video in the comments. He loves Forgotten Realms fiction and he loves D&D. And so this is a book tag, but very much kind of inspired in a prompt way. Like the prompts are inspired by Forgotten Realms fiction and lore in particular, which I'm going to be just getting into. I've read a couple of Forgotten Realms books. I'm currently reading Azure Bonds and enjoying it. But I play a lot of Forgotten Realms D&D. I guess I run a lot of Forgotten Realms D&D. I like Forgotten Realms. We'll talk about it later, but yeah, I think there's more to be said for it than maybe some RPG and fantasy fans give it credit for. But yes, I will tag him in the description. So each of these prompts is a place or a person in the Realms lore, and they come with a quality. So the first, for instance, is Drizzed. Name an exceptional swordsman or warrior. And the book I've chosen, and I'll pick when I pick a character, I'll mention the book, that kind of thing, is Drizzt, aka the Legend, the Axeman. As many of you who watch this channel know, I love Legend, one of my favourite books ever, and I love Drizzt, one of my favourite characters ever. And Drizzt is an articulation of the archetypal masculine hero who is perhaps not, is perhaps troubled by a life of violence. There is a no guns in the valley kind of vibe to Drizzt at points, but I think he is, he is the guy of the Iron Code, and never hurt those weaker than yourselves, always do good, that kind of thing. And the combat in general is great, and probably never better than in the Drizzt books. Not just this, but also Deathwalker and First Chronicles of Drizzt the Legend, and technically as well, not technically, the Skilganon books, the Damned books, which are called White Wolf and the Swords of Day and Night, or Night and Day. I'm sure my friend James can correct me if I've screwed that up in process. The second, so Drizzed, obviously the famous drow swordsman. Erevis Cale, a character with a haunted past and hope for a better future. This is going to be a controversial one, but what about Glocta in the first lore? That's controversial, I understand, because you're like, well, his past is haunted. Does he have a hope for a better future? What is going on with this character? A big thing, I think, with Glocta is that he is not the monster he believes himself to be. That's obviously an important, there's a generally important point in the first lore trilogy, which I kind of worry is missed. That they are essentially optimistic books about the way in which private virtue can be painstakingly, painfully, miserably developed, but which is the only bulwark against a uncaring world, it seems. And I think with Glocta, you see that thing where he has never actually lost his conscience, even though he says to himself he has. He does monstrous things, but cannot be brought to the uttermost generally. And that kind of leads him into decisions and situations which maybe offer ways out, or at least ways forward, if not ways out. Elminster, the wizard, of course, widely hated character in D&D terms, I think, as a sort of a perfect character who explains everything and has a not always attractive fictional voice when you're reading a book that's meant to give you game details and you're hearing this kind of fictional voice which doesn't give you the information you want. But Elminster, very popular character. Liam loves him. So unpopular in some places, popular in others. Ultimate wizard and mentor to heroes. I'm going to go for another wizard, Inspector Nightingale of the Rivers of London series by Ben Aronovich. Urban fantasy. Peter Grant ends up joining the magic squad of the Metropolitan Police in a context where there's not really any magic squad left. There's just Nightingale. Magic has declined and disappeared from the world, and now it's coming back. And I have issues with this series. I've read a lot of it, and I will keep reading it. I have issues with some things about authorial voice and tryhardism, but it is a good series. It often has good mysteries. Peter is a great narrator. The side stories are good too. And Nightingale is, except for when the tryhardism infects him and he becomes an uncomfortable voice for the author, he's a really interesting anachronism in the modern world whose character, who acts out of the characteristics which made him good in the past. And you should see him both adapting and not adapting to the modern world. And he is not a kind of Batman with Tim Drake in terms of complete kind of, you got to live up with the hard world, Peter. But there is a degree of devil-may-careism and letting Peter get to it sometimes, and being a bit distracted and distant, but combined with real power and ability and inspirational leadership, which is a good combination, I think. Seven Sisters, favourite set of siblings or family. So this is tough. I didn't actually think of many examples of, at least biological family particularly, but I could say the Bat family would be a good non-biological family, apart from, I guess, Bruce, one of his sons becomes Robin, or his son becomes Robin. But yeah, in other terms, let's say, and I think this is probably of the ones I thought about my favourite, Colm and Ardee West, if you want to talk about First Law, are not amongst my favourite sets of siblings as much as they are sometimes entertaining. But let's say The Chronicles of Amber by Roger Zelazny, which I reviewed last year, a really good book. It's 5 novelettes, I guess. There is a second Chronicle of Amber, which I have not read and I'd like to, about the next generation. But yeah, it's a fantasy story set in, essentially it's a multiversal story where there are lots of close parallel universes, and the Amberites are those who live in Amber, are those who live in what they would see as the first world, at least the archetype of order from which other worlds stem. And the royal family is large, many siblings, represented by magical trump cards, which is a really fun gimmick and really works, is one of the best things about it. In terms of its fantastical invention. And Corwin, who is a member of this family, starts losing his memory and having to find out what's going on again, as it seems chaos infringes upon Amber. Minsc and Boo, a hero with an awesome sidekick. So Minsc and Boo, I really like Minsc and Boo. Obviously, they're from Baldur's Gate. Big fan of Minsc, big fan of Boo. Some people, it's funny, isn't it? The giant space hamster thing is one of those things which, because of its apparent lack of seriousness, really alienates. But if you're actually playing that game, most people love Minsc, and I love Baldur's Gate. I guess it was my earliest exposure to early systems of D&D. Baldur's Gate 2, I guess, first, and then Baldur's Gate. But yeah, so Boo is the sidekick, I think. Is Minsc the sidekick, would you say? I'm going to say, well, Six of the Dusk, those magical birds, those kind of clever, like birds with multiple skills and abilities like that are magical. I think that is a really... Animal companions aren't really my thing, actually. I like them, they're okay, but some people obsessed with animal companions. But these are, I think, a really fun animal companion. Just because, they're birds, that's different. They're not wolves, they're not monkeys, whatever. And also the idea they have a variety of powers is a very Sandersonian way of combining the hard magic, the invention, and something quite kind of a good tag that you really like swords or light in other stuff, Alias and Dragonbait, a great duo. So I know Dragonbait from other fiction and books. Tomb of Annihilation, he's a character in the which is an adventure for D&D. Alias and Dragonbait. I've met Alias in Azure Bonds. I've been reading about her. She's fun. Great duos. I've got 2, and I think my favourite is probably Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. I think these are probably the best duo in sci-fi fantasy for me. Well, in general, in books. You don't often, outside of certain kind of law crime novels, you like Poirot and Hastings, you don't get many duos, and I guess is Hastings a sidekick? You don't get many duos in lots of these non-genre fiction things, and even crime fiction is a genre thing. How many literary fiction books are there like serious duos in? Probably some, but not many. But Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser are a big thing that is really nice about Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, and which in some of the kind of it's an early dark cynical fantasy. It's not really, but what's lost in that take is that a major emphasis of it is a hopeful version of the Wild Bunch. This friendship which humanizes both the characters, which when you look at, I think it's something where it doesn't feel like a Western in the way that some other fantasy does. Certainly Chronicles of Amber has a touch of the Western, and so does some of the other picks on my list, actually, which we'll get to. I love the Western as a genre, but it doesn't. It's not a Western in thematic terms on the whole. But there are some things about the way that friendship humanizes male friendship humanizes wild men, which I think is a really interesting and neglected thing. And you see, obviously, Jean and Locke people would point to as a modern example. So I think their friendship in Fafhrd and the Grey Mouse is actually my favourite thing in those books. The other one is indeed a fantasy western. Look, it's Alloy of Law, well, rather Wax and Wane. Look at this weird TPB. It's a UK TPB as well, which is rare. The other two I have much more sensible sizes for, and I'd like to replace this. But yeah, it's got a train on the front. No, this isn't a train. The train's on the second one, isn't it? What is that? Some kind of vault door? But yeah, it's Wax and Wane. I think these are underrated books. I think that the Wax and Wane books are less... It's because they are stylistically so different from the really everything else in terms of novels in the Cormyr, that people who are like, I love my epic fantasy, I love my 700-page books or 1,000-page books, I love enormous kind of stories and mysteries, and then you get these books that are like 300 pages, 330 pages, and have significant sections of fairly bouncy, vibrant action making up like, oh man, that's like a quarter of the book, and whose mysteries tend to, up until to a degree, Bands of Mourning, but even there, compared to Secret History, the parallel product, mapping the development of stuff from the first trilogy, the mysteries tend to be more intimate and domestic, and until Bands of Mourning, less worldwide. But Wax and Wane, for all the fact neither is a perfect character on their own, you can criticise both characters on their own, I think, as literary creations. They work together. They are a really nice duo. And again, there is some of that Western trope of the civilization of, and there are ways you can deconstruct that or think about other ways round, and I can point you to some Western films that do, but I think it's a good realization of that Western trope. Manshoon, a villain you like. Is Manshoon? I'm trying to think. Is he like a undead mind flayer or something, like a mind flayer lich? I'm going to say Thrawn anyway. Admiral Thrawn from the Thrawn trilogy. Nowadays, he has been recanonized into the Star Wars universe. And the thing with Thrawn is, he's not an anti-hero. He is a villain. You do not want him to win. You do not sympathize with his plight per se, partly because compared to, particularly in later books, Captain or Admiral Peleon, who you might be like, he is attempting to hold the line. He's attempting to piece things together in a galaxy which the New Republic has not solved. I think, Thrawn absolutely... He's not even ambitious for himself in the way you might think, but he certainly just wants to take over places, be the Empire, crush the rebellion. But I think the fact that he is set up as an Imperial outsider, he's an alien, he's a near human at least, a Chiss. The fact that he has this very distinctive way of thinking about warfare via art, the idea that art is a way, and culture is a way of understanding your opponent, and therefore things they may be weak to. As much as it's a villain gimmick, it's a really engaging villain gimmick, and there is a point at which he declares something artistic, which is one of the most winning moments in any book ever for any character ever. So. And I think they're good fun books. When I reread them, I think I did clock that Zahn is a completely fine writer, but was less of a good writer than perhaps I had remembered him as a younger man. But they're still perfectly solid, and I really enjoyed them. And when people say the sequel trilogy should have been the Thrawn trilogy, when you read it, you can just see thematically, plot-wise, characters, particularly Thrawn, why that is. They are so much more serious as a way of understanding the Star Wars universe than what we've generally had since Jedi. Some people would even say Jedi was one of the problems. So, Neverwinter, Jewel of the North, a setting or series of books not as grand as it once was. Neverwinter gets ruined in part by a volcanic explosion nearby. I don't really know, because I don't read lots of big series of books that I think fall off or become terrible. I don't actually know. So one of the nearest things to me, and I don't see this as a thing where it actually was bad, was I read 4 books of the Wheel of Time series many years ago and didn't go further because I was like, it's not really got me. But that doesn't mean it became less grand. Obviously, I didn't get to the slog, and it ends very well by all records. So I'm going to say, really with a caveat, I'm going to say A Song of Ice and Fire, in that, like, this is a perfectly good book, Dance with Dragons. I think we will see Winds of Winter, because I think probably it seems to largely exist. Even if Mr. Martin never finishes it for publication, it'll be publishable. But there are obviously things where he lost the thing he wanted to do, He gave it to the showrunners and they did whatever they did with it. And that has stopped him wanting to tell that story. It has been taken away from him. And that's why, even though he says he's constantly working on this book, he so often is like, oh, this new prequel idea has come up. Oh, I'm helping them with this. And I think you can, and there are even novellas I haven't read which are prequel novellas. On the other hand, the Dunk and Egg story is probably the best Song of Ice and Fire stories, if we're honest, or best Westeros stories. But yeah, so this is less glorious than once it was because we have like one of the best realized worlds and grimly epic stories of all time, and yet we're not going to see it completed anytime soon. We're likely to stumble along for a while and then eventually see it completed in some way, but whether that will be in any way fitting, who knows. And I think I'm sure you could find lots of examples of things like this. I just know that I haven't read as many things that either don't end and aren't satisfying or that fall apart. Waterdeep, City of Splendors. Name a book focused on one city primarily. Lies of Loch Lamora, where the city is a major character, and maybe the strongest thing about this book is that Cormyr is just such an excellent setting. Really well realised in a sort of thief story, heist story, which is interesting. I have a review for it. I think there are lots of good things to say about it. I think it doesn't necessarily hold together completely, though I did enjoy it. Baldur's Gate, name a setting where darkness lurks around every corner. I guess Baldur's Gate is a slightly grim place, isn't it? But I think Conan, I'm going to go for Conan with my nice edition of the Complete Chronicles, where Howard is maybe the best pulp accomplisher of the dark and twisty world where everything is dangerous and everywhere our hero goes there is danger. Partly that's pulp pacing. Conan turns a corner, a snake attacks. Conan turns another corner. He meets a woman. Turns another corner. The woman has betrayed him. There's a bit of that, but I think that Conan is just good fun and keeps the action going via this dark world in which Conan is a force of nature who breaks all before him. Candlekeep, a book that makes you think. Candlekeep is a library in the realms. Book of the New Sun, about to start volume 2 of this. Sci-fi, dying earth sci-fi, so on the fantastic side, particularly here. My understanding is some of the books in the same universe are not really dying earthy in their tone, which I think is such an interesting thing. The idea that when an author, and this is one thing I like about Wax and Wayne, when an author can switch subgenre not within his work or her work, but within the same world, I think that's a really impressive achievement that often shows the resilience and robustness of a world, is that you can tell different stories within it. The Book of the New Sun, it's an kind of literally insane story about identity, vision. It's hard to explain. I have a review. It's my best book of last year, Book of the New Sun, Volume 1, Shadow and Claw. There's a guy, he's a torturer's apprentice. Things go a bit wrong. He ends up leaving the Torturer's Guild and having to do other stuff. That stuff is often incredibly confusing, intentionally incredibly confusing. And what makes you think is trying to understand reality and also seeing this structure of ethics emerging about the nature of reality and what makes human interactions useful or valuable, maybe valuable rather than useful, is the way to think about it. Icewind Dale, a chilling book, chills, cold setting, creepy. Ancestral Shadows by Russell Kirk, his short stories. I would start here rather than with his novels, particularly his greatest novel, Lord of the Hollow Dark, because that's really the conclusion, the epitome and finale of most of his ghost stories. Also, it is probably less chilling. It has chilling moments and creepy moments, but probably there are points in reading this book where I wouldn't say I was horrified. It's not horror. Ghost stories are not horror. They are a kind of ethicalized fantasy, but rather moments of discomfort and creeping skin in several of these. So where you're just not always sure, you're not always sure what is about to strike you. Uncle Isaiah, an early one, is a good one for that. Balgrumo's Hell, which is a very important story. Lex Talionis is pretty good for that. Watchers at the Straight Gates. Not sure it's one of his best stories, but definitely has some for like, the invasion of the Church of the Holy Ghost. That's pretty discomforting, it's fair to say. There's a long, long trail of winding. So many good stories in there where Kirk, he's good at getting the chills, and he's good at bringing in the ghost story punchline. That is to say, the sort of, not necessarily the moral or ethic, that's not always how it works, though they are moral tales. Ghost stories as a genre are moral tales. They intend to be, they use the genre to do that. It's one thing to remember that at the core of The Exorcist, a horror film, there is some, it is much closer to the ghost story than most horror films we think of, because it has a profoundly ethical bent. But the ghost story is a very distinctive thing. He's just very good at beginning to bring out some of these existential concerns and raising them to our attention in these creepy, sometimes wonderful and joyful, and sometimes terrifying stories. Cormyr, a good Arthurian book. I'm actually running a campaign in Cormyr. The Dark Tower. This is the first book, The Gunslinger. Nine Princes of Amber, or rather the Chronicles of Amber, are Arthurian too. You could point to some of the Paul Anderson books, and indeed Jack Vance, Lyonesse, as having Arthurian contexts. And of course, I could just bring down a book of legends. One of my favourite early books was I still have it, a book of British legends, English, Irish, Scottish, Welsh legends, including lots of Arthurian stuff. But this is an explicit Arthurian retelling. Roland is the descendant of Arthur Eld, and the guns he carries are, they are his Excalibur. They are the great weapons of the rightful kings. And I think it's again another Western inspired set of books. That's the thing. The Draenei books, they are Western inspired. But yeah, it's another Western inspired book. Much like another, I've got one or two more entries on that. But where you have the lone man being civilized, whilst on his quest for justice, as Steve Judwood says in Ride the High Country. I just want to enter my house justified. That is definitely something which Roland thinks, but the meaning of which changes as the story goes on. And where the Arthurian background, which is inspired ultimately by the name from the poem by Browning, Childwell into the Dark Tower came, that kind of Arthurian background where he is not just the Western loner and drifter, but he is also the knight errant on the Grail quest, is really well done and drawn out. And there are some bumps along the road, so people have issues with virtually every book at some level. I controversially really like not just the conclusion as a general point, but the last book I really enjoyed. But I think if you want a modern Arthurian telling, it's probably the go-to place. By modern, I mean, retelling or reskinning. Calimshan, this is a book with a great desert setting. Well, Dune and Mars books that I've read are the obvious ones. Dune is set on a desert planet chiefly, and Red Mars was one of my favourite books last year, and is very much about the cultivation of a desert. I also like Burrows, which is a desert like Mars. But I'm going to say, partly because it's a different thing, and partly because I think there are some really interesting things about earthly deserts, as in where we get deserts in the Daevabad trilogy. It is a desert city, Daevabad, the city of the genies, which is full of intrigue and racial tension and magic, good magical systems. But there are also desert scenes. So Daevabad is one, it is a desert city, and there are scenes in the desert, and the desert certainly plays a strong part. The imagery depiction of the places is really effective. And I want to finish or read, I read like 2 chapters, but I want to read the 3rd book this year. I enjoyed the first 2 without necessarily thinking they're amazing, but I did think that the way the setting worked was often really fun. And that was a desert setting. Sembia, name a book series whose setting becomes less basic as the series or book goes on. I'm going to go back to the Draenei, the only time I'm repeating a book here. The Draenei cycle, it starts with a bunch of stuff going on, supernatural stuff and magic, and so it's not completely basic. Sembia, by the way, the gag here, I think, from Liam is that it was offered originally as a blank space for DMs to write their own settings, And then someone at TSL was like, that's valuable real estate. Why don't we publish books people have to buy about it? Fiction and RPG. But yeah, Draenei, it starts as essentially a fairly normal action fantasy setting with pulp fantasy magic. There are noble warrior monks with a divine power source, and which you wonder, it's something where I don't know if Gemmell had any influence from D&D, given this came out in '84. It was written in the several years earlier, like 2 or 3 years earlier. We are talking about something where it may well be a quite separate, more influenced by your Paul Andersons and by real world religion than by D&D. But there is divine power, but there's also dark magic. And he introduces other kinds of magic through the series. But there is a way in which it goes from being like normal action fantasy with some interesting pulpy fantasy magic systems. And then he adds more stuff. And he says, oh, by the way, there's this, there's shape changes, and there's this, and there's that. And then he's like, oh, by the way, maybe there's satellites in space. And maybe this is a fallen world, like a post-apocalyptic world. And then he's like, by the way, there's time travel. And that's the last book. It's something where he ends up putting conceptual density from a very simple, basic, base, a simple base. He adds on and piles up stuff by the end of the cycle, which, and I think he does a similar thing, though I've only read one book in it, in the Stones of Power series, where there's 3 sub-series, all of which interlink in different ways, and where you can tell he starts from even there, he starts, if you look at Wolf in Shadow, with a pretty mental beginning, but he just throws more stuff in as you realise that this is this thing that starts in a post-apocalyptic western, because the Draenei books are also westerns inspired by Louis L'Amour, but also fantasy. But yeah, and then it echoes through history with all kinds of different characters being drawn in. And then, where are we next? Deadlands, a comfortable fantasy setting. Spellfire. Not Spellfire, Forgotten Realms. I haven't read Spellfire. My kid was asleep, so I didn't want to wake her up by getting Azure Bonds. But yeah, the realms are a comfortable fantasy setting. I like them a lot. I think they are less basic and dull and not exciting than some people think. RPG-wise, I think there's a lot to a well-realised vanilla fantasy setting. And fictionally, I think, they're a good archetypal fantasy setting in which you can set a lot of different stories. So yeah, I'm looking forward to reading more stories in the setting. Thay, name a book or series with undead and or zombie-like beings. I feel like I should say I Am Legend here, except I haven't read it. And I can't think of many. The Shankar in First Law are halfway between orcs and zombies, aren't they, in terms of their presentation? I don't really know. I don't read much horror. I'm not massive into the zombie trope outside of the gaming table or away from the gaming table. But what I almost want to say, and the problem here is I've not really read any fiction in this universe, but is one of my favourite settings for RPGs, Deadlands. Look at this guy. Amazing piece of art by Brom. Wow, look at that light. Yeah, and there are multiple Deadlands. I don't even have one in print, Deadland Noir. You got the Weird West. I like Weird West stuff. I recently read a Jonah Hex graphic novel, which technically can be Weird West in itself. The Jonah Hex wasn't, but the backup features were great Weird Westerns. And what else have I watched relatively recently that, it's one thing, that film, that bad Will Smith film, The Wild Wild West, I kind of enjoyed because I liked the setting as a kid. I love the Western and I like sci-fi fantasy, and so the Weird West, great setting. The sequels include Hell on Earth, look at that Mad Max fella. He's a motorbike riding cowboy in the post-apocalypse, and Lost Colony, which is aliens in space, and of course there are good examples of the aliens in space genre. Sorry, cowboys in space genre. Firefly is, and indeed Star Wars are obvious examples of the space opera drawing on the Western more or less explicitly. But there are other examples too. I've not really read much Deadlands fiction. I haven't actually run Lost Colony, but I've always wanted to. I've run the other games. And then finally, at the end of this trek through the Forgotten Realms, Chult, a book with a wild setting, dwellers in the mirage is what I'm going to go for, which I've just finished by A. Merritt. I'm reading another book by him actually, but there's some a wild setting could just be crazy. In which case you can go for any kind of new wave fantasy and sci-fi. I think you'd be like, man, that's an interesting weird setting. Like Michael Marshall Smith in latter days, or would be a great example. But Merritt is an early sci-fi writer. First book, The Moon Pool, I'm reading was from 1919. This from 1932. And this is kind of, it's a Lost World story. It's got a kind of Cthulhu-like theme, very, very different. I'll be doing a review soon of both books. But yeah, it's what's interesting about the Lost World is how it is a really beautifully realized and described place that feels often very real. And you know, it's not luscious. This is a pulp novel. It is short. You don't get millions of words describing trees, but you get enough, and you get some really wonderful visions of, well, in fact, there's multiple places out in the Gobi Desert as well. He describes some stuff there that's really powerful. And Chulta's a jungle setting, so in that sense, maybe you're automatically biased toward thinking of Lost World types. And I do like the Lost World trope. It's something you get in some of the John Carter of Mars stories as well, of course. The idea that on this dying planet, somehow there are places that aren't dying, which is interesting, right? And of course, Burroughs also, same universe, early shared universe, but also Pellucidar, the Hollow World, inside Lost World inside our planet, and Venus, the Carson of Venus stories, and Tarzan, all four of his major series, which all interlink, all sometimes trade on Lost World stuff. But I think because I've just finished it, and because it was a really interesting experience that I'm looking forward to talking about. Dwellers in the Mirage, Cthulhu plus Lost World. Let's put it that way. So I'm going to nominate one person, not just book reviews, a booktube buddy of mine who has a good channel, talking about a variety of things. It is not just book reviews. He talks about films too and other things, but big into classic sci-fi and fantasy, big into James Bond, things like that. And I'll more generally say, because there are people who, maybe we should talk in the comments about this if you don't have a channel, but people who like the realms, who like fantasy, RPGs, and who like sci-fi fantasy in general. Yeah, I'll put the prompts in the description. Maybe you can tell me what would fulfill some of yours in terms of books or in terms of RPG setting kind of stuff. Anyway, I will leave it there at the end of a long video. Till next time.